The Outsiders is a story about a group of teenagers who live in a town divided by economic class. On one side of town, you have the Socs. They are the West Side rich kids. Then you have the Greasers. Ponyboy describes them as poorer than the Socs and to the middle class. He says the Greasers are wilder too. To illustrate the divide in their town, I drew a line down the middle of my paper. I drew the Socs on one side and the Greasers on the other side to demonstrate how divisive the town is. I also included quotes describing how they are stereotypically seen by others. I drew the Socs wearing bright-colored clothing to illustrate how they are usually wearing expensive, nice-looking clothes and have more money. The Greasers usually wear dark leather jackets, Ponyboy says, and I also drew the Greasers with weapons to illustrate how they're supposedly violent. I think The Outsiders is a counter-story that addresses stereotypes of the working class. People often assume that poor people are lazy. Poor people are not smart. Poor people are violent and always looking for a fight. I illustrated this single story in a way I drew the Greasers. They look rough and have weapons, and I included the quote, "Get lost, Hood," to illustrate how other people feel about them and the single story that they believe. Ponyboy and his brothers defy these stereotypes. That's why I drew them off to the side, a little bit separate from the other group of Greasers. They are not lazy. Their parents died in a car accident, and Derry is working hard to keep his family together. Derry could have gotten a college scholarship, but had to stay home. He's not uneducated. He just had to prioritize being the caretaker of the family over pursuing higher education. Ponyboy is smart too. That's why I drew him holding a book, which represents Gone to the Wind, which is a book that he talks about a lot in the story. He's not always looking for a fight. In fact, he says he doesn't even like fighting. On the far side of the group of Greasers, I drew Ponyboy and his brothers. This represents how they demonstrate a counter-narrative. At the bottom of the page, I drew a sunset. The sunset stretches across the line dividing the town. This represents the scene where Ponyboy and Cherry Valance are talking after the movies. Ponyboy is surprised when he thinks about him and Cherry watching the same sunset from two completely different parts of town. Two people who come from different backgrounds can have more in common than they expected. I also included Johnny telling Ponyboy to stay gold near the edge of the sunset. As Johnny is dying in the hospital, he tells Ponyboy to stay gold. This references a poem that Ponyboy reads to Johnny when they are on the run from the police and sitting at the top of the church on the hill. As they watch the sunset, Ponyboy talks about how nothing gold can stay. I think this alludes to the idea that Johnny wants Ponyboy to hold on to what makes him different than other Greasers. Ponyboy likes to read. He watches the sunset and is able to see the good in people no matter what side of town they come from. Johnny wants Ponyboy to not change that because in their town it's easy to fall into thinking divisively and thinking that nothing can change, and just because you're born into a different class than someone else that you just have nothing in common with them and could never get along. In conclusion, The Outsiders is a counter-story about the working class. It warns against believing a single story about people who have less money. It demonstrates how people are much more than how they appear on the outside. Ponyboy looks the same as all the other Greasers in his town, but he is different in his outlook on life and his hopes for the future. One challenge I encountered in making this visual argument was how to represent that while telling a counter-story, The Outsiders also contains some single stories as well. There are characters in the book, such as Two-Bit or Bob, who do not deviate from the single stories about their classes. Initially, I would have argued that this book is just a counter-story, but this assignment made me see how it can be viewed as both a counter-story and a single story, because even though Ponyboy and Derry and Soda Pop are different than the other Greasers, they are still subject to kind of the rules and regulations in the town, and because of the systems of their society, they still have a lot of problems and have to conform to that. I had a hard time representing this. I divided the page into 3 sections. The greasers and the socias are divided at the top, but then at the bottom of the page, with the sunset, they're not divided to represent both ways this book can be viewed. The Outsiders is both a counter story and a single story about wealth and economic class.